November 19, 1942, 06 watt hours, southwest of Serafimovich, western Don Steppe. The biting wind clawed at Oberleutnant Erich Vogel's threadbare greatcoat, a futile defense against the 20°C Siberian air. His breath plumed in frozen bursts, instantly dissipating into the vast gray expanse of the pre-dawn steppe. Below him, nestled in the shallow ravines that scored the landscape, the positions of the Romanian Third Army were barely visible, indistinct shadows in the gloom. An eerie silence, broken only by the incessant whine of the wind and the distant, almost imperceptible rumble of artillery, clung to the frozen earth. Erich, a liaison officer from the German Sixth Army, had been dispatched to this desolate sector for weeks, his initial optimism slowly eroding into a pervasive, gnawing dread. He adjusted the coarse wool scarf covering his mouth and nose, pulling it tighter. The cold was a constant companion, a dull ache in his bones, a sharp sting in his lungs. He thought of the letter from his wife, Liesel, tucked inside his tunic, its edges softened from countless readings. She spoke of the warmth of their Berlin apartment, the precious lump of coal saved for their small stove, the sound of their daughter, Sophie, laughing. The images were a cruel counterpoint to the desolate alien landscape stretching before him, an endless tableau of white and muted browns. Liesel's last words of encouragement echoed in his mind. "Stay safe, my love. We await your return from this victory." But victory here, on the flanks of the German thrust towards Stalingrad, felt like a hollow word, a distant dream. The Romanians, stretched thin, poorly equipped and utterly demoralized, were a brittle shield. Their positions were precarious, their trenches shallow, and their anti-tank guns antiquated 37mm pieces, incapable of stopping modern Soviet armor. Erich had voiced his concerns repeatedly to his German superiors, his reports detailing the critical vulnerabilities of the sector, the dangerously wide gaps between units, the lack of reserves. Each report had been met with terse reassurances, dismissals, or worse, silence. The focus, the unwavering, fanatical focus, remained on the distant, burning heart of Stalingrad. He squinted into the gloom, scanning the horizon. The rumble grew louder now, a deeper, more insistent growl that vibrated through the frozen ground. It was the sound of distant thunder, but a thunder that carried the metallic tang of destiny, a premonition, cold and sharp as the wind pierced his consciousness. The generals, obsessed with the prize, had blinded themselves to the peril. They had made a fatal mistake, and the bitter dawn on the Don steppe was about to reveal its catastrophic consequences. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was locked in a brutal attritional struggle for Stalingrad. Every street, every factory, every ruined building was a battleground, consuming men and material with insatiable hunger. The city was the prize, the strategic objective that had drawn the Wehrmacht deep into the Soviet Union. But its prolonged resistance had stretched the German logistical lines to their breaking point. To protect the vast, exposed flanks of the Sixth Army, stretching for hundreds of kilometers across the Don and Volga steppes, the German High Command, OKH, had made a fateful decision to deploy their Axis allies. Specifically, the Romanian Third Army was positioned along the Don River, northwest of Stalingrad, covering a front of approximately 160 kilometers. Further south, guarding the steppe between the Volga and the Don, was the Romanian Fourth Army. Italian and Hungarian units filled other gaps. These allied formations were meant to serve as a defensive screen, a seemingly formidable barrier designed to absorb any Soviet counterattacks, while the elite German units focused on Stalingrad. However, the reality on the ground was a stark contrast to the strategic illusion. The Romanian Third Army, commanded by General Petre Dumitrescu, comprised 11 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division, but these were severely understrength, often operating at 50–70% of their authorized complements. They were equipped with a mix of outdated Romanian, Czech, and captured Soviet weaponry. Their anti-tank capabilities were woefully inadequate, relying heavily on the 37mm Pak 36, nicknamed Hirsan-Klopfgerät, Army door knocker, by the Germans for its inability to penetrate Soviet T-34 armor. For every 15,000 Romanian soldiers, there were barely a dozen modern anti-tank guns. Many infantrymen were armed with obsolete rifles and had insufficient ammunition. Crucially, the front line they held was dangerously extended. Military doctrine suggested that a division could effectively hold a front of 10–15 kilometers. The Romanian divisions were often stretched across 20 to 25 kilometers, creating vast, thinly held gaps. These gaps were frequently patrolled by lightly armed cavalry or left completely unguarded, especially in the inhospitable terrain of the frozen steppe, which the Germans deemed impassable for major Soviet armor formations. The sector lacked deep defensive lines, engineer fortifications, or substantial reserves. The few German divisions attached to the Romanian flanks were either exhausted infantry or understrength panzer divisions, stripped of their best equipment and personnel to feed the Stalingrad meat grinder. The strategic gamble was clear. OKH believed the Soviets were too depleted and logistically incapable of launching a large-scale offensive, particularly in winter, against what appeared on paper to be a continuous front. This assumption, coupled with an almost pathological focus on Stalingrad, created a critical vulnerability, a fatal flaw in the German defensive architecture, waiting to be exploited. For the Romanian soldiers shivering in their shallow trenches along the Don, the German promises of glory and swift victory had long since dissolved into the brutal realities of the Eastern Front. These were not the elite, ideologically fervent troops of the Waffen-SS or the seasoned veterans of the Wehrmacht. They were conscripts, many of them peasants from rural Romania, ill-prepared for the rigors of a Russian winter. Their uniforms were thin, their boots worn, and their rations meager. Frostbite was a constant debilitating enemy, claiming more limbs than enemy bullets. Morale was catastrophically low. The Romanians understood their precarious position. They were holding a vast front with inadequate weapons against an enemy they knew to be formidable. German officers, particularly liaison officers like Erich Vogel, frequently witnessed the despair firsthand. Soldiers shared stale bread and frozen potatoes, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They spoke in hushed tones of families far away, of crops waiting to be harvested, of a life they feared they would never see again. The constant condescending attitude of their German allies, who often dismissed them as second-rate soldiers, only deepened their sense of isolation and resentment. The equipment was a source of constant frustration and fear. A Romanian infantryman knew his 37mm anti-tank gun was effectively useless against a T-34. He knew his rifle was old and often unreliable. Ammunition was scarce, meaning live-fire training was minimal. Digging proper trenches in the frozen ground was an exhausting, near-impossible task, so most positions were rudimentary, offering little protection from artillery or direct assault. The vast spaces between units bred a terrifying sense of vulnerability. A man on watch could stare out into the endless steppe for hours, knowing that a kilometer to his left or right, there might be nothing but empty, unpatrolled land. Rumors, dark and unsettling, were a constant companion. They spoke of massive Soviet buildups, of tanks and endless columns of infantry gathering behind the lines. They recounted stories of comrades on other sectors being overrun, of German units retreating and leaving them to their fate. The sound of distant artillery, often German, was sometimes a comfort, sometimes a terror, signaling that somewhere the cauldron of war was boiling. But the truly chilling sound was the sudden, profound silence of the steppe, a silence that felt heavy with anticipation, pregnant with an unseen threat. The Romanians knew, deep in their bones, that they were cannon fodder, placed on the weakest part of the line, guarding a flank that their German masters seemed to consider irrelevant. They watched the sky, they listened to the wind, and they waited not for victory, but for the inevitable. While the German high command was blinded by its Stalingrad obsession, Joseph Stalin and his generals, particularly Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky, were meticulously planning one of the war's most audacious and decisive counteroffensives, Operation Uranus. The Soviets had suffered catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, but their industrial base, relocated eastward, was beginning to churn out tanks, artillery, and aircraft in ever-increasing numbers. More importantly, the Red Army had learned bitter lessons and adapted its tactics. Stalin's strategy was built on a series of calculated assumptions about the German mindset. He correctly surmised that Hitler's fanatical focus on Stalingrad would lead to a dangerous overextension of German forces and a contemptuous underestimation of his Axis allies. Soviet intelligence, bolstered by partisan reports and aerial reconnaissance, provided a detailed picture of the weaknesses of the Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian sectors. They knew about the sparse anti-tank defenses, the extended front lines, and the low morale. The Don River Bend, especially the sectors held by the Romanian Third Army, was identified as the prime target, the soft underbelly of the German Sixth Army's defensive posture. To achieve strategic surprise, The Soviets launched an elaborate deception plan, Maskirovka, on an unprecedented scale. Troop movements were conducted primarily at night, under strict radio silence. Railway lines were constructed and demolished to mimic false concentrations. Dummy airfields were built, and propaganda messages were leaked to German intelligence suggesting a main Soviet offensive would occur elsewhere, further north or south. The goal was to draw German attention away from the Don River flanks and reinforce the German high command's existing bias that the Soviets were incapable of a major winter offensive. The primary Soviet expectation was that the Romanian lines, once breached, would collapse rapidly, creating a wide-open avenue for their armored spearheads. The plan was not to engage in another attritional battle, but to execute a classic deep battle encirclement. Two powerful Soviet fronts, the Southwestern Front under General Nikolai Vatutin and the Stalingrad Front under General Andrei Yeremenko, would strike simultaneously. Vatutin's forces, consisting of 3 armies with massive tank and mechanized corps, would smash through the Romanian Third Army positions northwest of Stalingrad. Yeremenko's forces would attack the Romanian Fourth Army to the south. The ultimate objective was to meet at Kalach-on-Don, approximately 100 kilometers west of Stalingrad, thereby trapping the entire German Sixth Army within a colossal pocket. The Soviet generals anticipated that the Germans, caught off guard, would be slow to react, their reserves already committed to the Stalingrad urban fighting, and their high command in denial about the scale of the impending catastrophe. The distant rumbling that Oberleutnant Erich Vogel had heard in the pre-dawn darkness quickly escalated into a thunderous, apocalyptic symphony. At precisely 6:30 hours on November 19, 1942, the Soviet artillery barrage began. Over 3,500 guns and Katyusha rocket launchers unleashed a devastating torrent of high-explosive shells and screaming rockets onto the Romanian positions. The frozen steppe erupted in geysers of snow, ice, and earth. Shrapnel whined through the air, tearing through the thin trenches and the hastily constructed dugouts. The ground vibrated with a sickening intensity, throwing men off their feet. Communication lines were immediately severed, leaving isolated Romanian units in a terrifying vacuum of noise and destruction. Under the cover of this relentless barrage, the Soviet infantry, bundled in their quilted winter uniforms, began their advance. They emerged from the ravines and folds in the terrain like ghosts, their bayonets fixed, their battle cries echoing eerily through the explosions. Behind them, the true horror of the offensive revealed itself. Hundreds of Soviet tanks, T-34 medium tanks with their sloped armor and powerful 76mm guns, and the heavier KV-1 tanks, rolled forward, their tracks churning the frozen earth into a muddy slurry. Erich Vogel, sheltering in a shallow trench with a group of Romanian officers, watched in helpless horror as the defensive lines simply disintegrated. The few Romanian 37mm anti-tank guns that hadn't been destroyed by the artillery barrage fired frantically, their small shells bouncing harmlessly off the T-34's thick frontal armor. Machine guns chattered impotently. Romanians, many still half frozen and suffering from shock, broke and ran, scrambling out of their trenches and fleeing into the open steppe, only to be cut down by pursuing Soviet infantry or crushed by the advancing tanks. Others, completely demoralized, simply threw down their weapons and surrendered en masse, their hands raised in the frigid air. The gaps in the line, which Erich had so desperately warned about, became gaping highways for the Soviet mechanized corps. T-34s, followed by truck-borne infantry, bypassed the remaining pockets of resistance, driving deep behind what had been the front line. German reserve units, thinly spread and lacking heavy equipment, were completely overwhelmed before they could even form a coherent defense. A handful of German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, hastily converted for anti-tank duty, managed to knock out a few Soviet tanks, but they were quickly outflanked and destroyed. Within hours, the entire Romanian Third Army sector had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. By midday, Soviet armored columns were advancing unchecked, their objectives hundreds of kilometers behind the original front line. The immense scale and speed of the breakthrough were staggering. The thunder of the artillery faded, replaced by the roar of tank engines and the distant chilling rattle of machine gun fire. Erich Vogel, now trapped behind rapidly advancing Soviet lines with a handful of bewildered Romanians, understood with a cold certainty that the fatal mistake had been made, and the bill for Stalingrad was now due. The front, which the German high command had dismissed as a minor concern, had just been torn open, and the entire Sixth Army was about to be swallowed whole. The speed and depth of the Soviet breakthrough shattered all German expectations. Within 2 days of the initial offensive, Soviet armored spearheads, driving from the northwest and the south, had covered immense distances, bypassing German strongpoints and overrunning logistical hubs. The carefully constructed German operational plans, which had ignored the flanks in favor of the Stalingrad objective, proved utterly useless in the face of this mobile, devastating assault. The German high command in Berlin, far from the frozen steppes, was initially slow to grasp the full extent of the catastrophe. Reports from the front were fragmented and often contradictory, a result of severed communication lines and the chaos of the Romanian collapse. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group Dawn, eventually recognized the mortal danger, but his requests for permission to pull the Sixth Army out of Stalingrad were met with furious denials from Hitler, who famously declared, "The Sixth Army will stay in Stalingrad." He still believed the offensive was a localized action and could be contained. However, on November 23, 1942, the unthinkable happened. The lead elements of the Soviet 4th Tank Corps, driving from the northwest, linked up with the Soviet 4th Mechanized Corps, advancing from the south, near the town of Kalash-on-Don. The two pincers met, effectively sealing off the entire German Sixth Army, along with elements of the Romanian Fourth Army, Italian units, and a smattering of German support formations, within a vast pocket. Approximately 250,000 to 300,000 Axis soldiers were trapped. The encirclement was total. The sheer audacity and success of Operation Uranus completely blindsided the German command. They had underestimated the Red Army's capacity for a large-scale winter offensive, overestimated the resilience of their allies, and critically, ignored the vulnerability of their flanks. The strategic mistake was not a single tactical error, but a cascade of misjudgments born from an overconfidence in their own forces and a profound contempt for their enemy and their allies. Hitler's repeated directives to hold Stalingrad at all costs had created a rigid operational structure that proved incapable of adapting to a dynamic and brilliantly executed Soviet maneuver. The German generals, so accustomed to the lightning strikes of the Blitzkrieg, found themselves caught in a trap of their own making, outmaneuvered and outfought by an enemy they had consistently dismissed. The pocket around Stalingrad was not just a geographic enclosure. It was a psychological one, too, a prison of their own strategic hubris. For the soldiers trapped within the Stalingrad Kessel, cauldron, the news of the encirclement spread like a cold, paralyzing dread. Initial rumors of a breakthrough, of a brief Soviet success, gave way to the undeniable truth. They were surrounded. The sound of artillery fire, which had once come from one direction, now came from all sides. The supply lines, which had been tenuous and unreliable even before the encirclement, simply ceased to exist. Hope, a precious commodity on the Eastern Front, began to die a slow, agonizing death. The psychological impact was devastating. For weeks, they had fought with a singular focus on taking Stalingrad, enduring unimaginable hardships for the glory of the Reich. Now, that purpose was stripped away. They were no longer the attackers. They were the hunted. The morale, already fragile after months of brutal urban warfare, plummeted. The cold, which had been a constant challenge, became an instrument of torture, exacerbated by dwindling supplies of winter clothing and fuel. Temperatures often dropped below 30°C, and frostbite and exposure became as deadly as enemy bullets. Food rations were immediately cut. The promised air bridge, decreed by Hermann Göring, proved to be a cruel fantasy. The Luftwaffe simply could not deliver the 700 tons of supplies required daily. Instead, a trickle of overloaded, often shot-down transport planes brought barely a tenth of what was needed. Soldiers quickly burned through their meager emergency rations. Horses, already suffering from malnourishment, were slaughtered for meat. Dogs, rats, anything that moved became potential sustenance. Starvation became a tangible, gnawing presence. Men grew weaker, their movements slower, their minds dulled by hunger and cold. Compounding the physical suffering was a profound sense of abandonment. The men of the Sixth Army felt betrayed by their high command, and most acutely, by Hitler himself. Their desperate pleas for a breakout were ignored. The rhetoric from Berlin remained resolute: hold every inch of ground. But for the men freezing and starving in the pocket, these words rang hollow, bordering on the insane. Discipline, once ironclad, began to fray. Desertions, though few in number due to the hopelessness of escaping, increased. Fraternization between officers and enlisted men, once taboo, became more common as the shared misery broke down rigid class structures. Oberleutnant Erich Vogel, having somehow made his way back through the initial chaos to a rear-area field hospital, witnessed the psychological toll firsthand. The wounded, already suffering from ghastly injuries, now had the added burden of utter despair. Their wounds festered, their bodies weakened by starvation. Men whispered of suicide, of simply giving up. The vibrant, confident German soldiers who had marched into Russia in 1941 were being systematically broken, not just by Soviet bullets, but by the relentless, soul-crushing despair of the Kessel. The psychological effect of the encirclement was a slow, agonizing demolition of the human spirit, a testament to the ultimate futility of a battle lost not on courage, but on a fatal, unyielding strategic blunder. The Battle of Stalingrad, which began with the ambition of conquering a city and ended with the annihilation of an army, represented the decisive turning point on the Eastern Front and arguably the entire Second World War. On February 2, 1943, after weeks of relentless Soviet pressure and the complete collapse of German resistance, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, now promoted by Hitler in a futile attempt to prevent his surrender, defied orders and capitulated. Approximately 91,000 German, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian soldiers, starving, frostbitten, and utterly defeated, marched into Soviet captivity. Of these, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home, many not until the mid-1950s. The impact of the Stalingrad disaster reverberated through every facet of the war. Strategically, the destruction of the Sixth Army and the demoralization of its allied formations created an irreversible shift in the balance of power on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht never fully recovered from the loss of so many experienced soldiers, officers, and vast quantities of irreplaceable equipment. The initiative had irrevocably passed to the Red Army, which would now steadily push westward, driving the Germans back towards Berlin. The Blitzkrieg was dead. The era of Soviet offensive dominance had begun. Politically, the defeat at Stalingrad was a colossal blow to Nazi Germany's prestige and a profound shock to the German public. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was forced to declare national mourning and admit to a great catastrophe, a stark departure from the relentless, upbeat messaging of the war. For the Axis allies, particularly Romania, the disaster at Stalingrad severely strained their commitment to Germany and hastened their eventual defection. For the Allied powers, it was a massive morale boost, proving that the seemingly unstoppable German war machine could be decisively defeated. For Oberleutnant Erich Vogel, who by a stroke of immense luck managed to be evacuated from the Stalingrad pocket on one of the last supply flights before the air bridge collapsed, the experience forever marked him. He carried the images of the freezing, starving men, the desperate faces, and the shattered hopes with him for the rest of his life. The fundamental betrayal, the fatal mistake of ignoring the flanks and sacrificing an entire army for a single city, became a deeply ingrained trauma. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It was a moral one, a catastrophic validation of the human cost of strategic hubris and ideological delusion. It illuminated the destructive consequences of an unyielding command structure, a refusal to acknowledge reality, and a contemptuous underestimation of the enemy. The legacy of Stalingrad was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, a testament to the fact that even the most formidable military can be brought to its knees by a single, fundamental, and fatal mistake.